And now it's my honor and privilege to introduce Professor Joseph Thomas, who will be the afternoon session chair and also our next speaker. Joe is the U.S. Naval Academy Class of '61 Chair and Distinguished Professor of Leadership Education. He's a retired Marine Corps Lieutenant Colonel. He also graduated from the Marine Corps Command and Staff College, and he's a past director of the John A. Lejeune Leadership Institute at Marine Corps University. He serves as a senior fellow in the Vice Admiral James B. Stockdale Center for Ethical Leadership, and he has authored 5 books on the subject of leadership in addition to a chapter in Leadership in Dangerous Situations. He received a PhD from George Mason University. Joe. Thank you.
Thanks, Al, for the kind introduction and the invite to this great day spent here. Certainly to one of my heroes, Colonel Fox in the audience, General Labudi, Mr. Galloway, and all the distinguished guests and visitors of this. It's a personal honor of my life to be invited to something like this. Now, you've probably seen in the brochure itself, the title of the presentation is Drawing Lessons for Generations of Warriors That Follow. But really, when I first got the invitation for this, and based on, as mentioned, what I do for a living, I kind of split my time in thirds, it might be said, teaching leadership, ethics, and law of war to undergraduates, that being midshipmen at the Naval Academy. I spend about a third of my time teaching graduate students, so Marine captains and majors, Navy lieutenants getting their master's degree in leadership specifically. And I spent about a little less than a third of my time with executive audiences, both as an executive coach and serving as the academic director for the U.S. Customs and Border Protection Leadership Institute, which are those familiar with the government system, GS-15s, 06 kind of equivalents on the civilian side, striking for positions in the SES, the Senior Executive Service, right? So I got to maybe have one of those right here now, it seems, with a badge. So between those 3 audiences, it's leadership development that's the consistent theme. And again, in being asked to address this particular audience, I thought perhaps even as important, perhaps more important, a question that I would ask of myself in this is, how is the service and sacrifice of the generation of warriors who fought the Vietnam War, how can it be honored? How is it best honored? Particularly somebody that's in the line of work that I am, charged with teaching leadership and to a lesser degree ethics. So, well, my primary professional and personal mentors, my role models over my career, certainly in the Marine Corps, or just life in general, have been Vietnam vets. Now, I enlisted in the Marine Corps in 1981 and was commissioned a few years later. So I'm of that age where, of course, I was brought up by people like those in this room. Since the mid-1990s, my career track has been to think about, to teach, to study, to write about leadership. So I'm going to focus my observations on that almost exclusively. In fact, I'm going to talk about the lessons specifically that my mentors taught me, some things that were kind of affirmed, confirmed in many of the discussions here this morning, and then again how I've tried to pass them on to those various audiences that I've talked about. Now, in the interest of time, I will say that I'm going to limit my points to only 6. While there are countless lessons of leadership I have picked up along the way from my mentors, and that begins quite honestly with my senior drill instructor at Parris Island, all the way through probably the most recent mentor in my life, Colonel John Ripley. Many of those out here probably know Colonel Ripley. He passed away in 2008, but for the past 11 years of his life, spent a lot of time kind of learning from him, specifically about leadership and leader development, and many, many, many others in between. Now, these 6 things were passed on to me by the warriors who fought Vietnam in word, but more importantly, the lessons that I took were primarily lessons of deed. And in some ways, these are the center of my teaching. So, first and most important lesson that I've taken is the power of example. Now, there's a lot of buzzwords in the field of leadership. By the way, leadership and leader development, there's some who kind of reacted like, wow. In fact, somebody at my table just before said, you know, can that be taught? Is that something that can be taught, or is it something that is developed over time? It's a great question. I ask myself that all the time. I would say that it's something that demands experience. There's certain theories that kind of play into it, but there's a lot of people cashing in on this, right? Leadership as an industry, as it's called, few realize is a $40 billion a year industry. $40 billion are spent in this country alone annually on developing leadership, right? The bulk of that is in the private sector. There's a full range of what that is, from kind of pop psychology, self-help type things, to much more research-driven, research-based programs run by places like the Center for Creative Leadership in North Carolina. So there's a really broad swath of what leader development actually is. And it's kind of ironic then, one might say, that I start this conversation with the big lesson learned, which seems patently obvious. It seems bloody obvious that the power of example is the most important thing. A lot of references here made to Quantico. In fact, the Latin term for leadership by example, ductus exemplo, is carved in stone in multiple locations at Quantico. It quite possibly is the oldest lesson of leadership that is in existence, of course. But again, there's in the literature of today, in the leadership literature of today, it's treated somewhat as a new phenomenon, that in complex adaptive environments, modeling of leadership is required, right? And those buzzwords quite simply are ductus exemplo. That's what they mean in the end. Now, of course, with midshipmen, with young officers that I have in class, that seems to resonate. They get that. They, like you, are a small subset of a population where that seems to be the initial message and the message that keeps getting drilled over and over and over again. But I'll have to say a word about one of the executive audiences. I mentioned this Customs and Border Protection Leadership Institute. One of the things that I do beyond classes and experiential activities with them, I've got a leadership at the movies night. So, Mr. Galloway, you're going to be very proud to know that the first movie that comes to my mind, of course, is the movie based on your great book that you co-wrote with then Colonel Hal Moore, Lieutenant General Hal Moore. And I always find it a little bit odd that these are folks, again, at the GS-15 level. There's always a small handful of folks who hadn't seen the movie. I don't see how that could be in this day and age, but there's a few that haven't. And we build a kind of a conversation. Popcorn, beer, as it should be, watch a movie, and then kind of debrief it, reflect on what are the really big and important lessons that come out of this movie. And I'm shocked often, particularly the ones who have not seen the movie, to say, wow, so, I mean, that's what leadership in the military looks like? Yeah, that's the hope, right? What is it about it that stood out to you? Well, there's that imagery of Colonel Moore, you know, first step onto the field at the LZ, and you know, everybody fans out to move out into the battle area in Idrang Valley, and also that very powerful image, equally powerful image, at the end of the fight, he's the last foot that gets back onto the UE before it takes off out of the zone. And there's some really deep reflection by people that have led, in some cases, by 20, 30 years, right? Not necessarily in the military, but in environments where there's high stakes as well, so federal law enforcement. And they kind of say, wow, that's a really powerful image that I had not thought of before, right? So again, to an audience like this, leadership by example or the power of example may seem bloody obvious, right? The interesting thing that I find time in, time out, even in somewhat seasoned audiences that involve folks that have been doing it for a long period of time, they are somehow shocked, surprised at what that was. And in some ways, the rest of the conversation, besides the direct lessons of leadership themselves, but the commentary about leadership as it was exercised in Vietnam becomes part of it. For some reason, that it becomes a novel thing that the leadership of Colonel Moore in the movie is selfless, it's sacrificial, it's altruistic, it's all the best aspects of leadership. I say, I just didn't think it went that way in that war, right? And I'm going to come back to this point in my sixth and final point about narrative. You heard a little bit about that this morning from a couple of different perspectives. There's an aspect of the message that I received from my mentors. I tried to incorporate as best I can into the teaching that I do, that comes down to the story that is told about leadership and about leaders. I think it's absolutely critical in all this. But first, on to the second point. Second point, this is one, too, that, like all of them, could seem kind of obvious, but centralized command, decentralized control, right? The current popular buzzword for this, and there's, again, plenty of buzzwords in this field of leadership, is empowerment. Empowerment is treated as if it were somehow new and novel. The military has long been known this term, maybe not by that word, but mission orders is a classical case of that. Mission orders is simply providing commander's intent, providing an end state, and then enabling subordinate leaders at the staff NCO level, at the NCO level, and so on, to actually figure out the how to do it, right? So you can place a buzzword like empowerment against it, but when you kind of come up learning from the experience of those who have actually exercised this type of leadership, it's a very, very powerful thing. Now, implied in this idea of empowerment, certainly in mission orders as it's applied on the battlefield, I think risk acceptance, understanding what's at stake in empowerment is really important. For a leader to somehow authorize those, give the responsibility to others to make decisions in extreme situations takes a great degree of courage, right? Because there's risk involved, because they may not do things exactly as you would want to do it. So the ability to communicate that's developed in this idea of kind of accepting risk is to ensure that everybody understands where things are going. Again, that's typically referred to in a military context as commander's intent. A powerful lesson I learned from my mentors across time and have tried to pass along. Now, that's on a micro scale, right? On a tactical level, you could say that conversation is. On the macro scale, I think very few people realize how the mindset of mission orders, how the mindset of empowerment and what it brings to the fight has influenced the U.S. military on the macro level in the wake of Vietnam. So if you have not heard this before, I'd kind of be surprised, but the example is the first Gulf War, right? The first Gulf War, in many ways, was won, right, on the mindset of those who fought the Vietnam War. Now, in the Marine Corps, there's a theorist that has been embraced, you'd have to say, over the course of the past few decades. He's an Air Force colonel, now deceased, named John Boyd. Colonel John Boyd is famous for a couple of things, but primary among them is his theorem, often referred to as the OODA loop. Observe, orient, decide, and act. Of all the military services, without question, the service who kind of got the essence of what John Boyd was selling with his theorem was the Marine Corps, right? DoD on a larger scale realized from that lesson that we communicate, we lead in such a manner as to gain temporal advantage, or the advantage of time, right? So when the Marine Corps comes around to changing its doctrine, you could say in the late 1980s, Al Gray, then Commandant of the Marine Corps, Vietnam veteran, decides to change doctrine, creates this small piece of doctrine called FMFM1, Fleet Marine Force Manual 1, Warfighting. And it was all about maneuver warfare, which was understood by some with a thin understanding that maneuver warfare is a revolution in how we do things, how we lead, in fact, by somehow gaining positional advantage over the enemy, right? Had a lot less to do with it than this circle, right, of observe, orient, decide, and act, this loop. If you could do that faster, if those four things could be done faster than the enemy, you had temporal advantage, the advantage of time, and you would always win. The Gulf War is, in effect, won on those grounds. The leadership that's embedded from the Gulf War on and exists to this day in the Marine Corps and other services is based on those hard lessons of Vietnam, of the Vietnam War. Of course, again, the buzzwords around it are complex adaptive environment, right? The counterinsurgency warfare, or even the conventional warfare fought in Vietnam, is nothing if it's not complex in adaptive environment, right? So in so many ways, those lessons drawn from that period live with us today, tactically, strategically, and in my view, again, because of my narrow lane, the areas that I look at in terms of leadership and how we communicate. Third thing, unit cohesion is the key to success, right? Again, another one that sounds patently obvious. So what you do in the preparatory phase of combat enables success. We heard plenty of examples of how that actually looked, what that looks like then, and I would say what it looks like now is much the same, but that hasn't always been recognized. The personnel policies that were referred to today that govern the way we sent warriors to Vietnam, essentially on an individual basis, those are hard-learned lessons. Lessons that the Marine Corps and other services began to change as early as the late 1970s and into the 1980s, but have certainly paid huge dividends in the current fight in Iraq and Afghanistan. Sending whole intact units into the fight has paid some pretty significant dividends on a variety of things, to include the psyche of the warriors engaged in the fight and coming out of the fight. And that's one of my other points I'll get to in a moment, but a significant part of my research and writing has been on this issue of combat operational stress, otherwise known as post-traumatic stress. So I'll talk a little bit about that. But a large part of that had to do with the personnel policy, hard lessons learned of the Vietnam War. Now, length of combat tours is another lesson. Most of you talked about 12, 13-month tours. That has certainly changed to a great degree, certainly in the past 15 years, at least on the Marine Corps side, based on many empirical studies conducted by those with Vietnam experience. So one thing that Al mentioned, of the roles that I held, and quite honestly, one of the roles that I played professionally that I feel best about, I suppose. I retired in 2005 from active duty in the Marine Corps. Had a nice, comfortable faculty position in Annapolis. Was loving life. Got a call from a former boss of mine working at Marine Corps University and asked me if I'd come back to the university to become the director of professional development, ultimately to stand up this organization that was referred to, the John A. Lejeune Leadership Institute. Of course, it's got to be named for the warrior philosopher of the Marine Corps, John A. Lejeune, in so many ways, who revolutionized the way the Marine Corps does leadership. The concept of the teacher-scholar model, very, very powerful one that still lives with us today, to look for leaders to look at subordinates not as somebody to kind of task and direct, but rather to think about their full, whole development, right? So of course it's going to be named for him. And in that role, I was kind of taken aback. Part of what I assumed I would be doing was focusing in on leadership itself. That's my PhD, my graduate work, my research has been in that, my writing has been in that. But when I got there, within the first few months, an article hits the San Diego Union Tribune. And it's an unauthorized release of a study that was done in Iraq. This is in the early 2007 timeframe. And the study was commissioned by the Department of Defense, and it was referred to as the MHAT-4 study, the fourth version of the Mental Health Assessment Team Survey. It's kind of a misleading term. It was a survey about how Marine soldiers, others felt about leadership and how it's exercised over them in combat specifically. And it's never a good day if you get a message, the Commandant of the Marine Corps wants to talk to you, right? Could never be good. You know, I think I'm going to be cutting carpet here. The Commandant of the Marine Corps at the time was General Conway. And so the conversation kind of sounded like this. All right, this MHAT-4 has hit the papers. It's an unauthorized release of this thing. We're not sure where it's going. There's a good news, bad news story to this research. and I had not seen it before. And the good news story is Marines feel very, very strongly about the leadership that's exercised over them in combat. They feel very strongly that their NCOs, their staff NCOs, their officers are doing right by them. They're well led. The downside of this is that they, on a far larger degree, to a far larger percentage, are more apt to make what could be considered ethically problematic decisions in combat, right? And what I mean by this, kind of cryptic words, is they were probably more likely to bring harm to non-combatants or post-combatants. They were more likely to, post-combatants being somebody that's already surrendered, more likely to cover for the bad behavior of fellow Marines by lying, right? So if you think about it, at first when this article hits, we look at this and say, wow, that just doesn't sound right, that Marines are somehow more dishonest. It doesn't make any sense. But if you think of the root of this, and this is the work, this is the research that had to go into kind of digging out the reasons, the very thing that makes cohesion look the way it does here, with people who have been away from active duty for so long, but still come together and bond, almost as if you had only been apart a week rather than decades, right? That same bond that's built between Marines, among Marines on the field, causes them to, first and foremost, not think about themselves. They're not lying or doing bad things to cover themselves or to protect themselves. They're doing it to cover, protect, defend the Marine to their left and right, right? So the positive quality, the positive attribute of loyalty to your fellow Marine has a downside. Who knew, right? Who knew? Now, I should have known because, again, my mentors all had Vietnam experience and told me things directly related to this. One of my mentors, a guy by the name of Paul Rausch, Colonel Paul Rausch. He's kind of a giant in the field of military ethics. Had written extensively about experiences of moral failings in Vietnam and the hard lessons about how they kind of splashed on everybody else. So some of these findings that Colonel McGinty points out here, I mean, Colonel Rausch is trying to get at the heart of why the American public reacted the way they did. And it wasn't for tactical failures by any means. Just that the Tet Offensive story kind of brings this out, illustrates it perfectly. The American people are disappointed not for tactical reasons or not for the obvious reasons, but by reasons they think that somehow warriors aren't keeping faith with what they're sent to do, right? And when that story is a wrong story, when that story is not facts-based, when it's not facts-driven, it's that much more tragic. It's that much more tragic. So essentially, I spent the next year and a half trying to cobble together a plan to ensure that this didn't happen to our current generation of warriors in Iraq and Afghanistan. And I had a personal stake in it as well as a professional, because my own sons were rotating in and out of combat tours in Iraq at that particular time. Which all leads me to the fourth point, related directly to this, and that is the best warrior care is principled leadership. For years, 5-6 years, I was asked to be the keynote kickoff speaker for these events called Returning Warrior Workshops, held around the country, different city in the country every month. So it was a lot of time in the air, because sometimes these things were in Honolulu or Miami, and I'm flying from the Washington area to attend these things. True labor of love, though. And much of what we talked about in these Returning Warrior workshops really are the hard lessons of Vietnam. We're not speaking about Vietnam specifically, but again, that insurgency environment, that complex adaptive environment formed the basis of it. And reintegration of warriors has to be done in very deliberate, well-planned ways. Right? That's something that was very, very clear in much of the research post-Vietnam. Now, some of you may be familiar with the work of Jonathan Shea. Jonathan Shea is a psychologist based out of Boston, worked at a VA hospital there, wrote a couple of books, one called Achilles in Vietnam. If you have not read it, I recommend it. And the other one's called Odysseus in America. And as a psychologist, non-military veteran himself, but devoting a life to working with not simply military veterans, but veterans of the Vietnam War, had some very clear messages about, and research-driven messages about what cause post-traumatic stress or combat operational stress. And it is, quite simply, what psychologists refer to as cognitive dissonance, right? A fancy term with what you think is going to happen, what you imagine happening doesn't look like reality, right? And it's that cognitive dissonance that's really at the heart of it, that confusion that results from it. It's not the trauma itself. It's not simply being exposed to horrors of combat, but it's not being able to make sense of those things. And most importantly, on the way back out of the fight, not being given time to kind of decompress in a valid way. So while I mentioned what I was doing in this effort was these returning warrior workshops, part of my life's work after that point became after the fight, focusing on those things that we could do for the current generation of warriors, right, to ensure that they don't experience, as best we can mitigate this, that they don't experience to such a great degree this idea of cognitive dissonance, right? And I think in many ways, these returning warrior battalions, wounded warrior battalions and so on that we have, both in the Army and the Marine Corps today, the Wounded Warrior Regiment and so on, they're growing smaller now, thankfully, but they're designed to do just specifically this. Those lessons are rooted in your experience. Number 5, culture is king. Now, the warrior culture of the Marine Corps particularly, I think, has ensured its success from its founding. And culture, by the way, there's many ways to define it. There's international culture, there's organizational culture. For our purposes, I'm going to say it's the traditions, icons, patterns, and norms of large institutions or societies, right? So culture is to an organization or a unit the way personality is to an individual. Now, of those 3 things that I say I do in terms of teaching, my day job really is teaching leadership and ethics at the Naval Academy. And core courses, we try to focus on this culture and make sure that we transmit the best aspects of culture. One of the elective courses that I teach is called Code of the Warrior. It's based on a book by the same name of a former colleague of mine. And we take a survey of these various warrior cultures from ancient times to present in order to pick from them things that are similar to this day and things that are important for us to learn from, right? Code of the Warrior. And I've got to say, what I hear today in this conversation, what I learned from my mentors during my Marine Corps career is very, very clear. Success moving forward, success in the future is rooted. It's formed in a foundation of concrete by the types of stories that you tell, by the things that you hold dear, the ceremonies, the celebrations that you bring to the table, such as the one that Colonel McGinney again mentions that you're going to be having shortly with your 50th anniversary at the basic school. When you take those lessons back to Camp Barrett, where the basic school is at Quantico, I'm not sure you fully can appreciate the degree to which those lessons have a ripple effect across the entire force, not just the second lieutenants at TBS, but there's a ripple effect that goes down, that it's impossible to put a finger on where the end of that ripple effect actually is. So in more ways, in more opportunities that you can tell this story, that you can confirm the best aspects of Marine Corps culture to anybody who's listening, but particularly to the latest generation of warriors, I really would ask that you do just that, right? There's great power in it. There's great power in all of these stories and transmitting, communicating these stories as best you can. Culture is, in fact, king. And then the last one, I said I'd bring it around full circle, and that is narrative is the key to learning in so many ways. Now, people learn through stories. There's no question about that. Compelling stories told very well. It's true for undergraduates all the way through the executive level. Adults appreciate, so to speak, adult learners, those in later years, appreciate good stories as much as young students do. But we have to get that story right. And that's why I think this conference, in so many ways, and some of the work that's done by Vietnam Veterans for Factual History is so very, very important. For too long, the narrative of the warriors who fought Vietnam has kind of been hijacked. In some cases, I refer to it as the Oliver Stone narrative, right? So many of my students at all these various levels, when they think about particularly leadership and as it's exercised in Vietnam, they bring to light these Oliver Stone stories, right? Who was a Vietnam vet himself, but has a very one-dimensional view. And it's one that was mentioned where, leaders are incompetent or flat out evil. They were more likely to be fragged than they were to be followed, and all up and down. And, even the staff NCOs, platoon sergeants and things like that, if they're not smoking dope, then they're evil themselves and they're making bad ethical decisions. And so that one-dimensional story of it has hijacked this larger mission. And I think the danger to that is not in the disservice that it does to the warriors who fought in Vietnam, but the disservice it does to the larger message of leadership kind of moving forward. So we try our best at the Academy and other places to kind of change that narrative. And my final point, and I'll end on my final project that I've taken on here in the past few months that I think you're going to be interested in, even if it's indirectly. So several months ago, started a project in coordination with a film company called Three Penny Productions. The bulk of their work has been sports stories to this point. If anybody gets HBO or Showtime, like a season at Notre Dame is one of the things they did, and other things of that ilk. And they approached us a little while back. Some folks approached us about bringing the story of the current generation of warriors to light and doing kind of a sanity check on the current generation of warriors coming out of this last 15 years of combat. And when I heard about the opportunity, I said, absolutely, I want to do this. So I've held a series of interviews to this point with young men all. The plan is to do far, far more with young men and women coming out of the fight. But I'll give you just a couple of quick examples of these stories. First interview we do on film, a 2009 West Point grad named Ben Harrow, right? Double amputee. There's every reason, he's a varsity lacrosse player at West Point, by the way, while he was there. There's every reason to believe that the trauma he experienced, double amputee, in fact, so close to the pelvis that he was told initially that he could not get prosthetics. He'd be in a wheelchair for life. But Ben Harrow, special operations type, 7th Special Operations Group is what he did his last 2 tours in Afghanistan. The one he was, first it was 10th and the second was 7th in Afghanistan. The nature of his story, though, is fascinating for a lot of reasons. And it has almost nothing to do with his catastrophic wounding. The nature of his story was, I sat down, I'm just sitting here, I'm going to be in a wheelchair for the rest of my life. What can I do? So he started just kind of looking on the internet. He started watching TV about things that had to do with prosthetics. And he found out some random piece of information somewhere along the line that there are models in Asia who are intentionally getting their legs broken in order to, in the healing process, there's some kind of radio wave therapy that they undergo, that in the healing process they can actually grow by an inch or 2 or 3. They can get taller because there's more of a market out there for taller models. So it's this random fact he comes across and he says, you know what? I wonder if that'll work on my stumps such that they are, because they're not much of stumps. Within 6 months of experimentation with this and some conversations with surgeons at Johns Hopkins Hospital, he winds up getting this radio wave therapy. And he grows 6 inches of new bone on his femur. And they said, first of all, this is unprecedented. We don't know if those things can handle prosthetics. They handle prosthetics. He's up on 2 prosthetics today, walking upright. He walks into the interview with me, and his entire story is one of fascinating, inspiring resilience. Now, he's medically retired from the Army, but his story goes on and how he's going to be a CEO, in my mind, at some point in the near future, right? He's brilliant, and he's driven, and he's smart. And the story is one of optimism. And that's something that runs counter. And then there's more of these that go on. A young man, class of '98, graduate from the Naval Academy, was with DevGru, or as it's popularly known, SEAL Team 6, 6 combat tours between Iraq and Afghanistan. Hellacious experience. Spent virtually his entire adult life either preparing for, in a pre-deployment cycle for combat, or in combat. Gets out from the Navy, and he's another one. Has gone into the private sector, and he's going to do phenomenal things. So the narrative now, the narrative that we're trying to ensure that doesn't get hijacked, is that these young men and women coming out of the fight are exactly like this generation